This week we're talking about what do year 12s need to know. Before we jump in, I'm just going to share this. And I think, let's acknowledge that it'll be different, and the state of what year 12s are going through is going to be really different in the different states and the different contexts. And I think, there's a small group here today, and I think it's really important. And Sam and I were saying yesterday, we've got one kind of view. So we're going to really try and open up that view to a broader picture of what's going on across the country and across different demographics as well. As always, throw us a follow on Twitter if you're on there to spread the word. But what we thought we'd do to start with, well, first, when we were talking about doing this, and we mentioned it in the last session, we had a little discussion about it. And it was there was very little feedback about, let's have the answers, what do year 12s need to know? There was a kind of lot of, well, it just is what it is. And I'll be completely honest, I was a bit tempted to shy away from the whole thing and go, okay, well, there isn't a lot to talk about. It's just not great. But thought we probably shouldn't. And then I spoke to Jim today about his views on what we should be saying and what we should be talking about and what were the positives and productive things. And he said as well that he'd turned down lots of ABC interviews and appearances because he was trying to shy away from it as well. Is that right, Jim? You mean?
Yeah, it's very difficult not to sound sort of the harbinger of doom, and always mindful you don't want to try to say something optimistic and motivational to anyone really, but certainly to young people who are making transitions. But you've got to balance that against the realities, and it's a very tricky one to navigate, I think, because the realities are different, and the outlook, from my perspective, is quite lumpy. That in some areas things are going absolutely gangbusters. People like, I have out of shot here a couple of boxes just delivered from Who Gives a Crap, the toilet paper manufacturer, and they can't make enough, and they've expanded rapidly because of this situation. So there are winners and losers for sure, but so we mustn't always sort of suggest that everything is doom and gloom. But unfortunately, it's the prospects and the perspective and the outlook at the moment do seem to be probably gloomier than they have been since, I don't know, maybe the 1920s, perhaps. I don't know. Not that I was around then.
And we've also got Sam McFetridge from Winona here, who's made it onto with an upgrade of Zoom in 5 minutes flat. That's genius. And Sam, you're always fairly positive, so it's great to have you here and get your perspective on the practical side of what we can actually tell year 12s and what they need to know at the moment. So for a bit of bigger context, I dug into some of the actual stats around, what's COVID doing for unemployment and underemployment, before we zoom into year 12 in particular. And obviously this is a little bit doom and gloom again because it is the stats, but I think it's really important to have some of the up-to-date data. A lot of you will be very familiar with this already, and I'll share these links. But in terms of, youth were already not doing great in terms of employment stats. We know there's been this panic and stats going around for years now around the unemployment rate of young people, 15 to 24-year-olds compared to the general population. And that little yellow circle there shows back in December 2019, the youth unemployment rate was already double the rest of the population before any of this happened. And then if we look at what happened in April, the unemployment rate absolutely rocketed from March to April. Unsurprisingly, across the board, obviously, but the first question would be then, how does that compare to the rest of the population? And we can see that youth were really overly affected by this, probably because they're overrepresented in some of the industries that have been the worst hit in terms of part-time jobs and early entry jobs. I've got lots of friends with companies where the first tranche of cuts and redundancies, despite JobKeepers, were, you know, the young people who needed training, who weren't paying their way yet. It was that investment in the future. And obviously the retail and hospitality sectors that have been, and fitness and events that have been really impacted, are very skewed towards young employment. So you see on that graph that this is like youth employment as a percentage of whole population, and went from 60% again down in April down to 54%, which is a huge drop for the whole population. So they are disproportionately affected. And we might say, okay, that's okay because it's just during COVID and things will change again. There's also underemployment. So not just those employment stats themselves, but the underemployment has dramatically risen as well. So this is the number of 15 to 24-year-olds who say they're working fewer hours than they want to. From March, 56,000 up to 484,000 in April. So that's where we see the massive reduction in hours of part-time jobs. And again, all of this is slightly masked from what's underlying it by JobKeeper. So a lot of them will be on JobSeeker. A lot of those part-time casual ones won't be. And then we look at, okay, what's happened in previous economic crises? Like, how will we come out of this? What can we expect to see on the other side? You know, if we say, a lot of the time we're hearing airlines talk about, you know, we'll be back to flying in 12 to 18 months, or, you know, once a vaccine is bought and secured as early as the beginning of next year, then we'll be back to something a bit more normal. But actually what we've seen is the speed of and the depth of the economic crisis, even if we look at it compared to the global financial crisis, it actually takes much longer to recover, particularly for those in that age group who are young and just during that transition from education to employment. So the GFC line there, we see the red line, which is young people went in at a much better, much healthier rate than the general population went into the GFC, but actually they went deeper in terms of unemployment and have taken much longer to recover. And in fact, never really recovered in that 10 years. They haven't closed the gap again by that disadvantage. So it's not great. We know that it's going to happen. It's going to take a long time to recover. It's going to impact their careers for the next decade. And, you know, potentially in terms of policy and debt of the economy as a whole, they'll be repaying at a much higher rate as well. So even those that do have great jobs, this is super doom and gloom. And I know I'm normally the positive one and Jim's normally the really negative one. But, but I thought it was good to just have like, okay, what are we dealing with here? And then if we look at the inequalities of different parts of that youth population, again, looking at the GFC, those who were not studying full time and didn't have a degree were much worse off. So we see socioeconomic tranches really disproportionately effective as well. So we see those pockets of long-term unemployment really struggling to make it back. And we know what's happening in those communities of the social impact, the community impact, psychological impacts, health, all of those knock-on effects. So there's some really massive issues that, you know, we hopefully see some policy. You know, we've seen massive investment in mental health resources, in JobKeeper and JobSeeker that is planned to continue for a while, and a lot of changes to education, which I think we'll get into in a minute, and whether they're right or wrong, at the same time as some other reforms that might be an unfortunate coincidental timing, but we'll get into that in a second. Emotionally, we've got stats again that have come out this week, I think, from Origin, saying 30% increase in mental health issues for 12 to 25-year-olds. And we know already that ongoing unemployment and that lack of direction increases mental health risks. So it's not just the economic risks. We know you can't have, they're really closely related. Now I was thinking like, okay, what would we say? What are the things we'd say from a practical point of view? Just, you know, we need to have a plan to move forward. And I've gathered a lot of this from asking people over the last few weeks, what's your what's your best advice? And some of them are, have a plan to move forward in some way, balance the short-term situation with long-term goals, try to come out the other side with a bit of a competitive advantage. People are advising people to get really flexible about, creative about using flexible work to their advantage. And whatever you do, stay connected to either education or the labour market. But it doesn't feel to me like that's enough, and it's not practical enough for year 12s themselves. So I would love to bring Sam in, and guys, this is quite a small group. I think there's only 20 or so. So please feel free to use the chat or unmute and join in the conversation. Let's get it interactive. But Sam, what's going on for you at Winona and within your network? What are you hearing around year 12s and their prospects and hope, I guess, for the future at the moment? Oh, are you muted?
Yeah, no, all good. No, I was just digesting all those stats that you popped up on the screen, and I was taking a couple of notes. But yeah, I resonate really. I think the flexibility that these students have is pretty remarkable, and I think young people are naturally they have that sense of positive outlook. But it's really hard because it's so uncertain at the moment. So it's how do you provide that certainty that they need? And I think that comes down to modeling that sort of behavior. Particularly, I suppose, an example is with educators. We've had to adapt really quickly. We've had to be really flexible in what we do. And I think the students within our environments across all schools have seen that. And I think that's a really valuable thing that adults can also, particularly in their work and with the conversations that they're having with young people, is show that they have been doing that themselves. But yeah, like I still think, there's that sense of I want to know, but I can't give you the answers. So that direction of moving forward is really, really important, and actually breaking it down into a small, like small steps, as opposed to this is a really big, large thing, because I think that makes it more realistic for the students as well. But look, in my work at the moment, what I'm doing with the students, I'm definitely talking about flexibility. I'm talking about adaptability. My conversations are steering back towards skills as opposed to occupations. So I'm definitely talking about those transferable skills that students need to think about long term, playing that long game, that learning is lifelong. And that, if they're adaptable and they're flexible, then they will get to where they need to get to, but they're still moving in that forward direction. So I think those messages are really, really powerful. And that links in with that reassuring bit too, because the students then want to see, if they can see the adults in their world modeling that behavior, and they can see that you're being flexible and adaptable, and I think that's a really, really important part that we need to do, particularly in that education sector at the moment.
That's a really good point, actually, when you're thinking about the positives and modelling it. Whatever the doom and gloom behind the scenes and the worries, they have never been through an economic crisis and don't know the reality of it, and it's not necessarily going to be the reality of it this time. So I guess that's really important for us to not focus on that and the predestined kind of it, and make sure we kind of can prolong the hope and positivity, and keep them moving forward. That's a really good point. And especially I think for teachers, yeah, as you said, that demonstration of how everyone's adapting to the environment is a really good example.
And sorry, Jim.
I just wanted to interject with some negativity there. I think it's admirable that you talk about adults modelling this. Unfortunately, we know from research that was done in Northern Ireland in the recessions in the early 1980s that kids who see their parents laid off work are far more likely to develop negative work attitudes. And it makes very obvious sense that, if you see mom or dad's lives being, in their eyes, wrecked, and perhaps seeing them very emotional, and seeing the financial implications and the upheavals that can bring to people, it's not surprising if those effects don't play out in people thinking, well, hang on, well, work is for losers, or work is you can't trust employers or what have you. So despite people's best efforts at modeling this stuff, inevitably, young people are going to be exposed to the financial and the emotional upheavals that come with their parents and their family members losing jobs. So I think it's, in a sense, Sam, it's reinforcing your point about the importance of trying to model positive things. But there is that reality that you need to think about. The other thing I just want to say briefly about that is you said that kids need certainty. I don't think they do at all. I don't think anyone does. But we've conned people in our field to believing that the future is certain. And when we strip all that away, when events like this happen, in a sense, for some kids at least, one way of presenting this could be, this is the best opportunity you've ever had to get your parents off your back about long-term expectations, and you can experiment. You can go and try things out. You can do curiosity-driven. There's small steps that were mentioned. So there could be an opportunity here for kids to not have to commit overly in terms of what they're doing. And, we can point to all the stats about the number of kids who drop out of university or change course in the first year when economic circumstances are great. So in other words, in fact, the reality has always been there's a lot of churn, a lot of people changing their minds, a lot of uncertainty. Maybe now the uncertainty is a little bit more forced, but it could be seen as an opportunity almost for a breathing space. Whereas in a really strong economy, funnily enough, some parents might be even more competitive or have even greater expectations of their kids. And the kids feel they have less excuse not to do something. So funnily enough, there might be a little positive in there for some.
I think that's come through from a lot of corporate world feedback around learnings as well, that breathing space, and almost like it's okay because the whole world kind of pressed pause for a bit. And it was like, wow, nobody's getting ahead, or that freedom to explore almost is really powerful. That is a positive that I didn't capture before. Have you seen that at all, Sam, or anybody else? The lack of expectations, almost like the lowering of expectations for what you should have achieved by this point.
I think what I've seen with our Year 12s, and I think this is a positive to build on what Jim said, is that because parents have, many parents have lost their jobs or changed their jobs, but I think people have witnessed businesses pivoting, to use that word, and using skills that maybe they didn't think they had to use before. I think this is a really good opportunity to talk to students about those skills that we, the employability skills or the 21st century skills or whatever we call them, that those are the skills that will get them through difficult times. And I think it's an opportunity for parents to see that as well. And parents are living it and seeing it in their colleagues and in their friends. Whereas before, certainly in my school, it was all about the ATAR and what marks you got and getting into the best university. Now I think parents are actually valuing more those other skills that we've been talking about. And this is a really good opportunity to say to the girls, these are the skills you need to get you through. Sorry, I'm talking about girls because I teach at a girls' school. But yeah, I think that is a positive. I think it's an opportunity to get parents to see the bigger picture, perhaps, than what they've seen before. Almost
questioning what success in life is, almost.
Yeah.
That's a huge. If it's an opportunity for that, I think that's absolutely massive. And I think we've talked in these sessions a lot about that set path of ATAR, uni equals rich equals success. And if we can actually unravel some of that and make it questionable, that I think would be a huge positive and take a lot of pressure off. On one of the points that someone just raised about uni and dropout rates, do you think people will be more inclined, students be more inclined to stick with something once they're in, rather than switch?
That's an interesting question. I mean, if I was advising a kid who got on well with his parents, and his parents or her parents had no particular financial imperative to boot junior out to make a living, I might possibly, and it goes against, funnily enough, a lot of the advice I've given over the years, might say, get into university, stay and do as many courses as you possibly can, and wait for the storm to pass and come out super qualified at the end of it, rather than trying to go out there and make your way. And for years, I've said to people, I've been skeptical about people going back to university. I said, unless you are really intrinsically motivated, or there's a clear business case for doing it, be careful, be wary. Don't necessarily go for the sake of it, because it's an expensive exercise and it may not necessarily advance your career. But now it strikes me that it could well prove to be a bit of a haven, but a haven where you're personally developing and you're developing new skills. So you're positioning yourself. I think a lot of this may well be about sort of like the beginning of the Sydney Harbour yacht race, that you're spending all your time trying to position it so you're at the start. So when the wind finally does pick up and the gun goes, you're best positioned to take advantage of that. Yeah. And that would be, courses and all the usual things. All of us would recommend: networking, joining things, volunteering, getting involved, getting your name out there, or keeping your name out there. So you're not just treading water, you're not just serving in coals, but you're adding to your skill set and you're adding to your network.
Building that competitive advantage for the other side, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sam, in terms of, we won't stay on uni forever, no, it's not the only path, but in terms of the unis and advice you're giving students, is there anything different about the choices they're making or what they need to navigate when it comes to decisions for next year?
Yeah, I think at this point in time, and I think the students really need to stick to there's a couple of things that is influencing what I'm saying here, but I think the students are getting inundated with, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but try to be a bit more diplomatic, but they are getting inundated with lots of marketing material, lots of early offers being thrown at them. It's making sense of that noise with all that information that's coming at them. So my advice to them at the moment is, really think about what you want. And, if it's that university experience that you want and you've got that idea of what you want to be doing, stick to your guns in that area of expertise. It's definitely an attractive option for them, because I think obviously schools are a protective factor for young people, and they like that sense of community. So in terms of that next step of their transition, they're wanting that sense of belonging or belonging to something. So potentially being a safe option for them. But I think, certainly it's the work that I'm doing at this particular point in time. Like, our students are on trials at the moment, but it's around making sense of that noise. And I think students on this occasion are receiving a lot more attention, a lot more, offers in that space. And it's also, assisting them, how do you make the right decision? And it's a really, really difficult one, because, it's great for those students to be receiving those offers and having that. But, when there's multiple ones, it's, how do you make sense of that? How do you know it's the right decision? And it's really hard for them to navigate.
And it's not that, from the way I understand it, in terms of marketing and sales, it's not super regulated. In what you can, it's almost, if you've got it, it's more like a company can go for it. And if you've got the resources to market on advertise,
yeah. Absolutely. And that traditional offer period has changed significantly too. I mean, like, only in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, we've really sort of started to see that sort of drag on longer throughout the year, whereas you would have that shorter window where that sort of would happen. So, yeah, definitely, it's sort of happening at different times. There's multiple aspects there, and then that can influence the way they might make a decision. So, yeah.
I think interestingly, you talk about regulation. For the first and only time in my academic career, putting my academic hat on for a second, at my current billet some years ago, we were all obliged to go through Trade Practices Act training. So there is a sense, at least in institutions I've been associated with, that you can't go around making completely outrageous kind of claims of come along and study with Jim and you'll end up being a millionaire or whatever.
Yeah.
It's funny, I think there's a bit more of a line in the sand actually with the kids these days. Like the ones that I've got that are dedicated, keen, they're well and truly got their university hat on. They know exactly what they want to do course-wise and they've got a pathway sort of set in that direction, are well and truly heading in that direction. But sometimes those ones that were sort of on the cusp, not really sure if uni was actually really the right fit for them, are actually almost pulling away from that at the moment and possibly considering more vocational training and things like that. And can I actually say if that's a silver lining in this, that those students make those decisions and make better decisions actually at a lower qualification level and then pathway to wherever they choose to with a more educated sort of view, like that's not a bad thing to come out of this either. That's not a bad sort of outcome really.
Yeah, it's really going to help that push of like balancing the options out. And that's amazing that they're doing that, because I think with the previous system of uni being path A and everything else being secondary, as the unis are giving more offers out and trying desperately to get bums on seats, it'd be very easy for students to kind of go, hey, if they want me, I'll go. And as we talked about, we've got the dropout rates are still going to be there and they're not going to be guaranteed. And now with the fee reform, there's potential that they'll lose their access to HECS and HELP as well.
I think it's really,
work ready qualifications I think have got a little bit more weight behind them really, which is like your vocational. So
I think it's really interesting too, because I'm definitely seeing a lot more students that would do that traditional sort of gap year experience now looking at some of those, short TAFE courses and how can I upskill in that space with maybe developing a skill set there. So I'm definitely seeing a bit of a shift. And this is not only in my community, I'm talking with other colleagues as well, with students that are looking at, different options of building their skill set, whereas they would, they may travel or they may go over to a different country or do something different in that sort of gap transition period, whereas some of them are now looking more, well, maybe perhaps I might apply myself to a short course. I don't have that longer commitment there. I can build up some skills here. And I'm definitely seeing a shift in that space.
I've seen the same into those little vocational, they're like, wow, I can, get a digital marketing qualification in 6 months, or be a kind of qualified user experience designer at low level. All of those, the ones that were the early Hyper Island General Assembly, it was more the digital and tech and design schools that came up early. And I'm seeing a lot of interest in those and a lot of success and them springing up everywhere for those, just in time, just enough, just for me courses that promise, wow, you will be qualified in this. And it's really kind of, it's kind of the short version of the degree apprenticeships, isn't it? And again, with a lot of promise for you'll come out the other side with this qualification that means you get, you'll be able to earn 75 grand. But, that they have their own issues in terms of promises as well in this environment.
And learning's lifelong, we compartmentalize everything that, that primary, that secondary, then the tertiary or whatever it is that they do. Whereas learning is lifelong, and the fact that they can do it in smaller little sections and chunks and maybe go in and gain some more experience somewhere else and then come back and do, it provides greater flexibility and adaptability there for them as well. So
absolutely. And what about in terms of labour market fear? I've had lots of parents talking about, but what do we tell them now? Where do we look? It was already a bit crazy, they wanted that guarantee and that certainty again of, what are the growth jobs of the future? And I think this has just proven that nobody knows. Have you actually got to the point, or anyone got to the point of just saying, we don't know? Really, honestly, we don't know.
Yeah, me about 20 years ago. So, yeah, I mean, if I have to sit through one more, I'll use bad language here, bullshit presentation by a so-called futurologist at the end of a conference about the future of work, I think I'll stick my cake fork in their nostrils. It's just, we are waking up to the fact we may not like the idea we can't predict the future, but we are waking up to this, and we need to get away from this sort of infantile dependence on horoscopes and tell us what the future is like while we all stick our thumbs in our mouths and suck contentedly and feel like it's all going to be okay. Because that's essentially what the psychological process is going on there. And I think trying to predict these things is very difficult. Unless you want to say something moronic like whatever happened in the past is most likely to happen in the future, which is a reasonable bet most of the time. But they don't. They overextend and start making lots of silly sorts of statements, or start statements that are bleeding obvious. We need to, I think, the stuff you started off with, everyone was talking about flexibility, opportunity awareness, curiosity, taking small steps, doing small courses. The reality is these are the things which actually do work, but we've been stuck in our field with this silly rhetoric, or we've bowed too readily to the demands of people who have asked us to be able to predict the future, be able to predict what people are going to do, what's going to make someone happy in 20 years' time. Well, I think what we're seeing increasingly is you can't do that. And as opportunities increase, as globalization, when it's available to us, is out there, the opportunities are overwhelming, they're complex, they're interchangeable, and they become far less predictable. And so making these long-term bets about where you're going to be or what you're going to do actually may not be very sensible, because it may mean that you're just becoming inflexible, all the things which are the opposite of what we've been talking about. So, so as far as I'm concerned, people start talking about future of labour markets, go to the bar, do something else, go outside, write poetry, sing, dance. But
what about students' plans? Have you seen aspirations shifting, or people fundamentally changing plans based on what's happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a student in my, a couple of weeks ago, and, she had always wanted to become a pilot. It was like, I'm going to become a pilot. We had experiences in pilot in the aviation industry. It was like, okay. And then having that conversation going, well, actually now, given the fact that there's not that much work in that industry, well, so we steered that conversation around back to, okay, well, what are the skill sets that a pilot needs? And we found that link with the love of maths. So then we started to look at, okay, well, if we worked out that was the link, and it was the maths, and obviously there was the flying there, so there was a shift, and she went, well, maybe I might go, say, data analytics, or because I'm really interested in numbers and I'm fascinated by that. So I definitely think that the young people are looking at those things very carefully. But, part of that conversation and the way that I steered it, and I said, well, we'll pick up again eventually, so don't rule that out completely. But, if you develop a really broad skill set in this space and you have the opportunity to work in that, think about all those other skills that you're going to develop there. Again, that focus, that shift on that occupation, it's linking that back to the skills. And once we found that link with the maths, we were able to unpack that. But that's, conversations of many that are happening at the moment with young people. So
it's a bit sad, Sam, because there's going to be a pilot shortage still, I dare say. Like, clearly it's not ideal for the next sort of 18 months or so, but the prediction in the next 10 years is there'll be a huge pilot shortage. So it's a bit sad that she'd give up that dream just because of that. Well, and I understand what, like, you've got to back yourself, but
yeah. And it's just saying to them, don't rule it out, yet, like, okay, immediate future, but there's, if you keep building up that skills, you can still get there. But it's amazing that something so significant can completely throw a spanner in the works, and that directional change happens really quickly. So
if she's got good maths, she could stick close to airlines by working as a receiver to put them into receivership and liquidation.
Yeah, there's those options as well. I mean, it's just the fascination, I think, with the airports. So, but that's one story of many.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, I think we've got to be careful about thinking that this is all unprecedented. Because the reality is that these sorts of things happen all of the time. I remember I think it was called Black Monday in Britain in the 1980s, and a whole bunch of graduates were supposed to be going on to the Marks and Spencer's retail graduate program, which was seen as a very elite program for people back in the day. And they had so many people, half the intake were given vouchers, were given, I think, 500 quid back in the day to go traveling. They were actually paid to go backpacking just so Marks and Spencer's could deal with the demand to get these people through. And by the time they came back from their beach holidays, there'd been the crash and there was no jobs. Now, that was kind of in the 80s. That's not so long ago. And there are loads and loads of examples of things like that. And there's loads of examples of airlines, Ansett going bust not so long ago. So I think I'd be encouraging you to use this as an opportunity to tell people that there are constantly things changing. And even if it's not economic things changing, it could be their own circumstances. It could be the status of their relationships or their health, you know, and all these things change. And I think we just don't do enough to sort of build that in. We're still too much based on, you know, follow your passion, follow your interests, and be relatively inflexible in terms of doing that. And I don't think, I think all that's happened with the COVID thing is it's stripped away a lot of that rhetoric, and you can actually see how the system works a bit. That's my view, but anyway, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I think that's what Sam's saying in terms of the flexibility. It's the skills, broad skills, and flexibility and adaptability that's the key. So,
yeah,
so I guess the big question is, if we look at that whole cohort and we look at all the things we've been talking about around careers, education, and the priority within schools, could we have prepared them better? Do you feel like they're prepared, or could we have done it better? If we went, okay, this is the hindsight, they're exiting year 12 into turmoil, what could we have done better?
Could I just make a comment, because Victoria has had to endure a second lockdown. In fact, even after the stage 1 lockdown, we found that our year 12's resilience, their independence, etc., had grown substantially because of the fact they were forced, in a sense, to rely on themselves because they were at home. Yes, we had, you know, remote learning, as everyone did, but when we went into stage 2 lockdown, yes, there's a level of anxiety constantly because it's about year 12, but they were prepared for it. So I think they're well and truly developing some of those employability skills through this whole experience. You know, some of them will just need to write COVID, and that's their demonstrated evidence. But yeah, so that question, hindsight, could we have prepared them better? I think most kids have exponentially got some of that preparation this year.
That's really interesting, that it will actually be a massive benefit to them. The COVID kids will be highly employable because it's just a given that they're resilient, adaptable. I wonder whether they'll actually feel a bonding as well. You know, they're going to miss out on a lot of things this year, but are they bonded through it? They'll miss out on the formals and so much of that's rites of passage. But do you feel like they've bonded as a community in their own right through COVID?
I think they feel a bit hardly done by, just quietly.
I definitely agree with that, yeah.
I think
it's interesting you say, actually, it's interesting to say, actually, the fact that you think your sort of group's going ahead like this. I reckon there's some that certainly are, and they adapted quite nicely to home learning in the first time, but the second time, and they sort of still trudging along. But there's some that are just not coping with it at all, like on a welfare sort of side. And you can, even those statistics you were talking about before, Liv, in regard to where kids are at on mental health and stuff like that. Like, yeah, there's that group is growing, I think, almost by the day.
Oh, definitely, yeah, most definitely, indeed. But I suppose just trying to look at some of the positives out of this, and I think, if anything, it's the parents have become far more anxious. I'm in an all-girls school as well, and yeah, so the parents have high expectations, and you know, COVID's just gone and sort of mucked that all up.
I guess there's a couple of points there, and this is not meant to sound harsh, but it's really a provocation. But it's looking at Liv's question in terms of other things we could have done better, more systemically, longer term. You know, it really shouldn't take a national catastrophe like this, or international catastrophe, for people to be developing that resilience, and we shouldn't be leaving for people to just pick it up along the way. What are we doing systematically to teach them flexibility, curiosity, optimism, persistence, and the rest of it? And I think there's a systemic challenge there for us, and I think that links into the mental health thing as well. That if we set kids up with the expectation that the world is going to be controllable and predictable, and then they get thrown into a world which is quite the opposite, then it's hardly surprising, with my psychology hat on, that they should end up with some significant mental health issues. Now, that's a grossly oversimplified kind of analysis, but I wonder whether by actually telling people how it is in terms of the world, in terms of things being uncertain, and talking about strategies and introducing strategies and teaching people not how to set goals and how to have plans, but how to abandon goals, how to redo plans, and how to find opportunity in situations. I was just thinking back to people like my grandmother's era, who used to do things like reuse tea bags, and she came through the Depression and she came through the Second World War, born in the First World War. And that generation, it's very dangerous to talk about generations, and I generally don't like to do it. But that notion of improvisation, not meaning to make do with what you've got and make the best of what you've got and use things in creative ways. And that generation are often seen, rightly or wrongly, as quite resilient because of that. And I don't want to push that too far, because I think there's lots of exceptions to that rule. But that kind of idea of teaching people to work with what they've got in front of them right now, rather than constantly having this Judy Garland over the rainbow type sort of thinking, might actually help in terms of the mental health stuff as well. I just throw that out there as a thought.
I see increasingly schools talking to us about, develop a long-term, like a K-12 or a 5-12 careers education program that is completely in step with the wellbeing program, knowing the impact of careers and future and hope for your future, the impact of that on mental health. I see increasingly those two coming almost inseparable. And I know a few people here work really closely with the wellbeing teams. Is that getting more generally the case, do you think?
I think it's about the overcrowded curriculum, getting access to the space, the time. Where I work, we've got a futures component embedded in a year 9 wellbeing overall program, and the girls really thrive on it. They really crave that. But again, that's because I pushed hard to get it in there. But I think fundamentally across the system, it's about this overcrowded curriculum. And yes, now principals might now admit, given the circumstances, what are we really doing to get these kids ready for this world? But they're not then prepared to devote the resources or the time to it, because somehow the curriculum still needs to be covered. Sorry, wearing my cynical.
No, I think that's true. But I can see, back to what Rowena's point earlier, that question of success is being questioned. That like Hayata, uni, rich equals happy. I think that is being called into question, and I think parents increasingly are seeing these mental health issues and the pressure, and it not turning into what they thought it was going to turn into. The system isn't working for everyone anymore. And I can increasingly see the pressure coming from parents back onto schools that might have been the absolute stalwarts of that system, saying, what are you doing to prepare my kids for this future? And, when we've talked before, again, about, how many schools have got, we are educating them for a lifetime of learning and empowering them to design their own future, but not really. But now I can see people going, where are you doing that? How are you doing that? So I think it can only be a positive for careers.
Here's a thought. I'll be provocative again. Standard consulting playbook from the 1980s onwards. As a management consultant would go along to a council or to an organisation, tell them that if you outsource to us your services, we can do it a lot cheaper and more efficiently than your staff in there. Step 1. Step 2, get the contract. Step 3, go and employ all the people that used to be employed by the council. And step 4, hold them all to ransom because they've no longer got the capacity to do it themselves. is there an argument that in the competitive world where schools in some sectors, or in perhaps all sectors, are competing for students, that they have acted a bit like consultants? We talk about universities overpromising, but have schools overpromised and said, don't you worry about that. You can outsource your parenting responsibilities. We'll do it all. We've got a great welfare set up. We'll not only educate them, they'll be well-rounded. We'll do the whole thing. Just leave them alone, almost set and forget.
I would question whether that was the schools over-promising or parents over-expecting.
Okay.
Or maybe even the government over-promising on the school's behalf. I don't think that's what schools necessarily are thinking in and of themselves. It's certainly something I believe is happening. I do believe that outsourcing is happening. Whether that's happening as a result of the schools desiring it and competing, or whether it's happening because the government's seeing a gap in the need for bringing up socially aware youngsters in order to avoid later issues, and they're trying to fill it through schools, is another issue.
Yes, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking actually when you were talking about sort of over promising things and what schools are trying to deliver versus what they can deliver. There are just so many restrictions on schools for what they can deliver. I went to a workplace learning meeting this morning, and they were talking about the COVID restrictions and where, we're in WA, so we've had very little impact comparatively from COVID, but there are still workplaces not opening themselves to work experience students and that sort of thing. And SCASA is having an absolutely no allowance given attitude for extending workplace learning opportunities or giving a longer deadline to get things done. And so I think with this idea of, what are we raising the kids for? How are we teaching them? What are we teaching them? And that kind of thing, it has to be a whole community approach. It can't just be that, the schools change what they're telling the parents, or that, the government changes what it wants the schools to do. Everyone has to be on board to try and get this new approach. And, I wholeheartedly agree that the purpose of education has potentially become confused, I'd say. But it's, how do we get that back on track, and how do we support the current students who are graduating? There was an article that I read recently that said that students who graduate during crisis such as this are usually 30% behind their sort of equivalents from their peers from other generations or other circumstances.
On economic measures, yeah, which obviously is the only important thing in life. But I was having this discussion at the literacy committee the other day. Sometimes you have to use measurables. Sometimes it's nicer not to. But so I think it's such a big question, and I don't know that there's really an answer. I think that's one of those things you go round and round about. We need parents to stop buying what schools are selling, and government and schools to start selling what parents are buying to make it. I'm just going to paste a couple of those resources that had the stats in from earlier there, if anyone wants them. Sam, what about, we talked about year 12s, what about year 11? How are they?
I think I'm probably more worried about year 11 than I am actually year 12. I think year 12, back to that point that we were just talking about before around them feeling united with a sense of going through something similar. I'm more worried about year 11 actually, to be honest. I think they, particularly, I'm just using university as an example here, but they're seeing, what's sort of happening and outplaying with the year 12 students, and they're thinking, well, if they're looking at year 11 results and that sort of stuff, and we're having an impact here, well, what's that going to mean for us? But I think now we've been in this period for a while, and it's like we're going to be here for a while. I think I'm more worried about year 11 than year 12.
I would agree with that. Yeah,
I think year 12s will be absolutely fine, and I think and year 11 will be fine too. But I'm more worried about year 11.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I think that sense of year 12, we're in this together. This is our year. We're going to be known as the year of, COVID. And when you asked the question earlier, what could we have possibly prepared them better for? Looking back, I would have said, pay attention to your year 11 end of year results, because they're going to matter more in year 12 than they used to. But now year 11's picked up on that. And so now, as somebody said to me today, instead of year 12 being the stressful year, it's now spread over 2 years. Mm-hmm. And so year 11s are starting to feel the stress of performing really well at the end of year 11, because maybe that's the mark that's going to get them into an early entry next year. So, and they're also missing out on that being special year, because they're not the COVID year, they're the year after COVID year. And things will have shifted, and they'll just have to get used to the new way of being. So the fact that this year 12 is not getting a formal, I know in our school everybody's bending over backwards to try and make opportunities and experiences special for year 12, because they've missed out on so much. But year 11's like the bridesmaid going, what about me? What about me?
Education disruption, same relation issues. Yeah, absolutely.
Community school, all those types of things. Yeah.
Any ideas? That's a whole nother session we don't want to talk about because we don't have the answers. But I think, is it just preparing, letting them know what's the reality of what's happening and keeping them informed? Are they hungry for information, or do they seem a bit resigned?
I reckon they're more hungry for information, because they're seeing that from the year 12s now, and they're seeing that play out. So they're going, okay, that's actually much sooner than what I anticipated. And because that whole goalpost has sort of it's moved and it's changed, I think they're now hungry more for more information. Whereas before, I think sometimes when there is too much information, it doesn't enable them to, move forward. Whereas now I think they're kind of going, okay, I actually need to sort of start engaging with this space, and this is going to happen much quicker than what I thought. So, I think they're definitely hungry for more information and trying to sift through that that's coming through with them as well. So, I think there's definitely a thirst there with the year 11s at the moment, but I think they're also very worried about how that's going to play out for them in their world and what that's going to look like, because it's not that far away, and there are higher stakes now in that space, in that year 11. Because when you think about year 11, it's been really used as a foundational year, to set up for year 12, and whereas now that's, the stakes are much higher. So I think they're definitely feeling it.
Yeah.
I think in terms of, and none of us know how the federal government will go with this, but there's all this debate about whether JobKeeper will stay or go, or what they're going to do. And that just reinforces what you're saying about year 11, in my mind, that in a way year 12 are almost done and dusted. But year 11 are more likely to have that impact at home if JobKeeper, when JobKeeper tapers off or stops altogether. And that will be yet another kind of adjustment point. It'd be lovely to think everyone just smoothly moves into employment and everything's wonderful, but presumably it won't be like that. And as this thing drags on, the impression I'm getting in my networks is that even with the existing supports in place, there are businesses in the usual suspect areas, gyms, cafes, etc., which are just going to the wall. They're just about coping. And they're closing down, and sometimes it's just also to do with the mental health of the people who own the businesses, or they've just lost, it's all too hard, they put their money and efforts elsewhere. So I get a feeling there's going to be a lot more disruption, and in a way that will probably play out more for the year 11s than it will for year 12, perhaps. I don't know, but it just strikes me that year 11 are going to get a raw deal, and maybe year 10 as well for that matter,
All right, we're definitely going to finish on some positives. So we got that there'll probably be more resilience coming through organically. They'll naturally have that resilience. Jim, you said one earlier that time is on their side.
Yeah, I was actually advice I was giving to my son, who has gone from working for Warner Brothers in London on a Batman movie to packing masks in a factory in Slough. And that's not kind of how he wanted his career to go. And my kind of career advice was sort of, suck it up, son, you're young. And what I meant by that was that you haven't got much to lose. You haven't got anything to lose other than time, and you've got more time than, say, I don't know, a sort of middle-aged worker who's got a big mortgage, loses their job, maybe has school fees. They've got an awful lot to lose, and maybe not as much time to sort of build back up afterwards. That may sound a bit harsh, but equally, I think there is a message you're hoping there for younger people that, it's not like they're seeing their life savings gone, or it's not like they're seeing their job that they love go and without any time to get it back. That may sound like thin gruel, but I do think that young people have got that opportunity to do that. And usually younger people, in their early 20s and the rest of it, they're not encumbered with children or relationships to the same extent older generations, 30 plus are. So they've got more ability to move around and take opportunities, take hits, take to their pay and so forth. And things will come back, and they already are coming back in certain areas. And in a sense, they're better placed than perhaps a lot of us in society are to be able to take advantage of those situations. So I do think that for young people in particular, there are some positives. But I'd love to hear your expert opinion. I imagine many of you are absolutely wincing and thinking, God, thank God I haven't got James as a father.
Isn't it funny? But you could also say that we've got a generation of kids now that can actually do learning in so many different ways to what they were doing sort of 6 or 12 months ago. Like, online learning is a completely different ballgame, and they'll be able to take that into lots of different levels throughout their whole career. They don't have to necessarily go to university during the day. They can do it around work, all those sort of things and stuff. So that they've got all that to look forward to as well, which makes it just so more versatile than it has ever been. So,
yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm going to capture them all, the positives. Any more positives? Come on.
I think, Liv, you should keep people on the line. They're not allowed to leave. You can't keep coming up with a positive.
I'm not sure Zoom have got that feature. Lock them in.
Yes.
I wonder if it's made. I wonder if it's made society a little bit more patient and understanding of everybody else. So I just, an example from school, there were sort of things that used to happen, and they'd have to happen in a certain way, and we'd have to do them by this deadline. And because of COVID, and we've all had to change everything, and everything's turned upside down, I've noticed people being able to just roll with it and just to go with whatever's happening, and that incredible flexibility of, oh, look, here's another restriction that we have to deal with. We'll just do it a different way. We'll change direction. And so I wonder whether younger people growing up with that will just become much more flexible and, that ability to adapt much more easily than I think we've already said that today. But I just think,
yeah, no, I like it.
Ability and shape shifting, if you like to fit the space that is available, rather than having to change the shape to fit me. I think, I think that's a positive that they're growing with now.
Yeah, and you just made me think of another one as well around much more accepting of people's whole lives. When everyone's remote working and having to time shift and. I think maybe we talked about it, and then I can't remember who I was talking about it to. But it was a group of females who were so used to, hiding the fact on work calls that they were doing the school pickup, but almost like trying to have a serious call, but on mute because they were running and doing other stuff and pretending that side of their life didn't exist. And suddenly now you've got everybody can see that the work bit is one part of your life, or the school bit is one part of a bigger person. And that they're all important parts of a whole life.
You can work and polish the silver at the same time.
Exactly. I don't think you would have done that 12 weeks ago.
Probably not. No.
I was wondering what you were doing before.
I've been polishing silver. That's what I've been doing.
I'll drop mine over if you like.
I'm having a dinner party tomorrow for the first time in an awful long time, and it's stressing me out more than any court appearance, any television appearance, anything else. So there you go.
I think on a positive note, for a long time I've been trying to get my students to recognise and value the importance of being transferable and of all your transferable skills. And certainly COVID has made that an issue at the forefront, which I think is important, sort of taking the focus away from this is what I'm going to be, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how my life has to be, to tell people they have to be transferable, which kind of similar points to the one that Rowena made, but just making it more specific about skills and why you study something, why you go down a particular path. And I also think from a purely teaching point of view, it's made incursions easier because people are happy to do them over Zoom now. I don't have to fill out all the paperwork for someone coming on school site.
Yeah, and I think I was talking to another at school today about them doing lots of career experiments and the amount of kids who are happy to break beyond their networks and talk to people and approach people, and how willing other people are to communicate because they've got more time and you can do it faster and more informally as well, rather than feeling prepared for everything. Yeah, I'm capturing that as well.
My daughter thinks it's perfectly normal to speak to the computer screen.
Yeah. I was just going to add in the importance of connection with community. I think was one of the most important things, because if you look at the students that crave to come back and connect and look up, and I think they've that the sense of community and belonging is one of the things that I think people have really worked and valued more, and it's become more visible, and the importance of it, particularly in your localized area as well. So that relational connection and the importance of community with people as well, I think has been a real positive that's come out of that. And knowing your neighbour and having those connections, those meaningful connections with people, as opposed to being on the screen all the time, as we are right now. But the sense of connection and community, I think, has been one of the big positives that have come out of this.
I think it's also stripped away some of the unnecessary nonsense that gets built up around work. Just before we came on air, I got an email from the university where I work part-time, asking me very, very politely and gently, would I mind terribly if a colleague shared my office? Now, I haven't used an office at the university in 5 years. And as far as I know, all of my belongings are put in a box with deceased written on it or something. And that sort of stuff, I think you become far more amenable to it. So you haven't got this silly stuff about fighting for the corner office or the comfy chair or all that nonsense, which has actually got very little to do with actually how we go about doing our work. And if you're working from home, you're not commuting, you've got time to connect with the community, you've got time to do those things. And I think you're probably more amenable to take on tasks that you might not be if you're commuting for hours and hours, or you're fighting off people who are playing silly games around the office and the politics. Funnily enough, I think some of the politics has dropped away, and some of the periphery has dropped away, and we're getting more to the essence of what tasks actually need to be done to keep the show on the road, and what stuff is less essential. So I think that could be a positive.
And I think that's the same in schools. That what really matters, and what are we doing for busy work, and that what is the really important things has come through from schools as well. I think that's a good list. And it's 5:40 if anyone wants to head off. Jeffrey, we haven't spoken to you in Singapore. How is everything?
Hi, sorry about wearing the mask. We are on a split team arrangement. So I'm in team B. I have to come to the office. The bargain is I have to put on the mask, and my neighbors have to somewhere else, and team A will have to work from home.
And how about everyone in schools? Are your team still going into schools?
Yes, the students are back to school. I think being an open economy, much more so than in Australia, the future is even harder to predict for us. So I think while the demand side is unpredictable and very volatile, I think what we can do is really on the supply side. How do we prepare our students? I think there are many positives, like what the colleagues here have mentioned. changing the conversation around career guidance to a very different kind of messaging about being resilient, being adaptable, being open to chance and to change. And we are, I think the good things that have come out is that we are able to develop packages for teachers to deliver in the classrooms, and schools are more open to be teaching some of these lifelong skills that can help to manage uncertainty in the future. So I think there are some positive things that come out of it. Yeah.
It's really hard to ignore why they're so important at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, yes. It's very heartening for us to have the Director General of Education coming out to say that more so now we have to talk about some of these skill set that's important to prepare our students for the future.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about whether we choose to have a lost generation or can champion them as a COVID-19 kids who are ready and more resilient for the future. So I think the choice is for school teachers to actually make a contribution at this time.
And that's all the way from the top down, really explicit.
Yes, yes.
Amazing.
It's good.
Thank you for sharing, everybody.